discussing some developments in the geopolitical realm. And that's very important. And we were asked to, well, they gave us some homework and they said, well, we would like to discuss about Europe, and Europe who is facing a dilemma. A dilemma, do we have to choose for militarization? Because a dilemma is a difficult choice to make between some options which are not very favorable. Or do we have to choose for civil security? And to make it a little bit more worse, it will come back. Yeah, probably. And to make it a little bit, it's the kind of perception we have. If we choose for militarization, it's an evil option. And if we choose for civil security, it might be an angel option with a white dove bringing peace. But that's a kind of perception we have in Europe. And it's not without reason, because Europe was the continent for the last 120 years where two major conflicts took place, the First World War and the Second World War, with a lot of victims. And it was also the place where the Cold War, which became never a real war, but it was a real security dilemma. So in Europe, this is most of the time the perception we have if we talk about militarization versus civil security. In other parts of the world, they think differently. They think differently. If you go to Asia, or if you go to some places in the African continent, they think differently than that. And to be honest, even in the Western world, this could happen as well. Where if we only trust on civil security, if we only trust on leave it to the politicians or to the diplomats or to economists, they will have huge academic debates, but no solution, never reaching the preferred end state. Where in military organizations, there's much more a can-do mentality, and we will make it happen, where with a quick solution, they probably will reach a preferred end state. So if you make this difference between militarization and civil security, we most of the time think in bad or evil. But I don't think in both of them. I think if we look to the world of today, you have to think in both. It's not this, either that. It's not a choice. For me, it's not a dilemma. For me, if I advise policymakers or decision makers, I would say consider both options. That's much better in the world we live in now than only choose for one of the two. And let me take you a little bit more back in history for the kind of conflicts we saw. We already discussed Afghanistan. The previous speaker, Mr. Becker, did already. But Afghanistan was a reaction to 9/11, where the Bush administration said to the government, at that time it was Taliban, and said, well, you are harboring Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda was, you know, Osama bin Laden, who conducted 9/11. And you provide them with training camps. And if you don't want to get rid of them, we will help you. So do it yourself, or either we will invade your country and come in. The Taliban refused, and America went in, invaded, and at that time they were very successful. But they did it with small units, together with the Northern alliances, supported by American airplanes, and this was their model. And they were very successful for the first half year. They had the initiative, and that all of a sudden changed. And there were two reasons for that. That was Operation Anaconda in March 2002. That was the big hunt for Osama bin Laden in the Tora Bora mountain regions in Afghanistan. But that operation was a big disaster. Parts of the army and navy were not able to work together. A second thing that took place was more on the political level, where Bush and his administration were convinced, and I don't say I believe them, but at that time they were convinced that Hussein was harboring Al-Qaeda as well. And they said, well, he is also having weapons of mass destruction. So we need to go in and to finish the job, which they already did during Operation Desert Storm in 1990, 1991. And it was supported by Prime Minister Blair. And you saw a shift in thinking in the United States already. And they lost the initiative because of that in Afghanistan. And they tried and retried it. They invited the NATO, and NATO went in with their International Security Assistance Force, ISAF. And they had a lot of soldiers. At the time I was over there and deployed there, I think that there were more than already, within NATO, already more than 200,000 soldiers, where the Americans had almost 500,000 soldiers. And the American generals and the NATO generals were still asking for more soldiers, for more what they call boots on the ground, because it was a conflict between people, and you should have boots on the ground to solve this problem. But that was not so very helpful. What we saw then in Iraq was, in 2003, in March, April, and May, was a quick march, a quick attack from Kuwait to Baghdad, and they had Baghdad, but all of a sudden it changed. The entire operation changed because they had to rebuild this entire society. And they were not prepared for this. And again, the generals, the American generals, were asking for more troops and more troops and more troops. And what we saw is actually that this model in the 2000s and the beginning of the 2010s was the most favorite model in thinking how to address conflicts and the security realm. And it was about air power, conducted by Western airplanes, where they had large formations, and they could throw bombs if there was any incident going on. They trusted on local forces, which we saw, for instance, with the Northern Alliances. And we have special forces from the western part. And those special forces were also able to guide those Western airplanes on their target, done by what we call forward air controllers. We even used it when ISIS came into being, and we even used it in 2014, 15, and 16. There was not so much willingness anymore among the politicians to add new ground forces to this. Only small units, specially trained, and for instance, especially with special forces, who could deliver military assistance to them. But that changed. And one of the biggest game changers is the annexation of Crimea. And that happened in the end of February 2014, and March and in April. And what happened is that the Russian Federation, more in particular, the Russian authorities showed us that to influence people on the peninsula of Crimea is done not by bombs and bullets, but it's done in a different way. It's done by creating perceptions, and it's done by what I call thinking in bits, bytes, and sound bites. It's another way of influencing people. And influencing people is really an important thing now in the armed forces. We are rethinking how to do this. Do we always need to use our weapons? Do we need our tanks or artillery? We try to convince other people to behave and to think differently in another way. And actually, Russia was showing us how to do this with the annexation of Crimea. Not one shot was lost. Not one shot was fired, sorry. And it was a completely different kind of conflict than Russia had before in 2008 with Georgia, because that was an armed conflict that took 5 days with a lot of casualties, where Russia invaded and almost took the capital of Georgia, Tbilisi, and due to an intervention of the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, and of course Mr. Sarkozy, who was then the incumbent chairman of the EU. They came in between and they asked at that time the Russian President Medvedev to stop these actions, and there came an agreement. But it was a violent, armed conflict, where here it was more creating perceptions. It was different thinking. And actually, in NATO, all the NATO leaders were surprised. They had not one explanation for what happened in Crimea. We lost the Russian Federation completely from the radar. The first one who stood up was this general, this American general, Philip Breedlove. At the time, he was the Supreme Allied Commander Europe for NATO. And he said, what we need to do, we need to think about, and which is still a buzzword in NATO, we need to think about hybrid warfare. We need to think about a hybrid concept, where it's a combination of regular forces, not to use them, but to deter other people, which is still a pillar, I think, of NATO. Using special forces, using cyber, but also using economic measures, where you can have incentives, but also sanctions. And it's about information warfare, and that was probably the most important part of it. And he said, well, what it does is this entire hybrid concept, it attacks the credibility of a state. Look what happened to Ukraine during the annexation of Crimea. And what is also important, he said, with all the information which is shared to us, which is also important, it creates and maintains a false perception of what is going on. Because the annexation of Crimea took place in the end of February 2014, beginning of March. And in April, with all our technology, with all our means, we were not sure who was behind this. We all thought it was the Russian Federation, but we didn't know it for sure. But then all of a sudden that changed because Putin made a proclamation in one of the popular TV programs in Russia, on Russia 1, their most famous channel, and he said, no, the Russian Federation was behind this. So from that point on, we know for sure that the Russian Federation was behind it. And what we need to do, he said, is we need to go for the comprehensive approach, which was already used in Afghanistan with not only the military, but to include much more means to address these kind of conflicts. He said we need to have diplomacy and politics, information, military, and the E is missing because the acronym is DIME, and the E stands for economy. So that should be added to this as well. He said that will bring the solution. And this was in the second part of 2014 when he came with this explanation. And it was followed in 2015 at the Munich Security Council, earlier mentioned by Mr. Becker, and they talked about it. And the Munich Security Council is an annual meeting of higher-ranking military, politicians, world leaders, academia, all together discussing this. And they already came up with this concept of hybrid warfare, where it includes not only the regular military forces, they're part of it. And are they used? They're much more used for creating perceptions and to deter their opponents instead of using them. But there is much more. There's economics, there's cyber, there's diplomacy, there's information. So it's all together. It's not either this or that. It's the comprehensive approach. You need to do this. And what it does, it creates perception. It creates, you can make yourself much bigger than you are in reality are. That's what, for instance, the Russian Federation is trying to do. And they're very successful in this. So let me take you and let this build this in a model then. At the left side you see the dime factors, because the power not only comes from civil security, not only comes from the military, but it's all together, and it's the dime. It's diplomacy, information, military, and economics. And for instance, if you break it down and use the other circles which were discussed at the Munich Security Council, you can create all kinds of what we call operation lines. And it all should come to one political end state. Are we using it in an offensive way in NATO? No, I don't think so. But we need to know, and even also not in the EU, but we need to know that there are some parts in the world who are thinking more offensively in this kind of model. And the thing which is a very strong force is history and culture. Today, a very strong force in what determines if we go and to have a quarrel and which becomes a conflict is identity politics. It's based on culture, religion. People want to belong to a group. And that's a very strong tie they make. And if something happens to this group, they will defend this group. And this is much more stronger in thinking nowadays than all the other factors. But was the dime enough and all the operation lines, was it enough? Before I go to this question, let me go back to this. Because if you have this model, and I didn't explain to this, if you have this model and you would use it and you want to leverage it and to have a maximum effect, then you must have a kind of strategic coordination where all the operation lines, all the effects you want to achieve on these operation lines leading to this political end state, they should be coordinated to have this maximum effect. NATO is just part of it. NATO is this part. Oh, sorry. NATO is this part, where I think that if you talk about the EU, it's this and this part. And is there a willingness to work together? There is. There are some initiatives, but there are also showstoppers. What about Turkey, for instance? Turkey is part of the NATO, but Turkey is not part of the EU. And if NATO favors something, Turkey will always block this within NATO. I saw this because in my previous assignment I was attached to a strategic headquarters in NATO, and I had a Greek colleague, and when he came up with an initiative, it was always blocked by my Turkish colleague who said, no, we don't do this. And the reason behind this was that they were never friendly invited to become a member of the EU, which was a highly frustration at that time. Okay, but back. What is this model enough to explain all the factors now in the geopolitical realm? No, I don't think so, because asking the question is answering it. I think that there is much more. If we look to certain conflicts, if we look, for instance, to what happened after the annexation of Crimea in the Donbass region, in Lugansk and Donetsk, we see a lot of separatists. But you also could project it on Yemen or other parts of the country. But the main question then is, where comes the money from? Who is paying for the salaries? Who is paying for the equipment, for the gas and oil, and for the munition? And there is a lot of money going on there. There's a lot of money. So if you could switch the crane and stop all the financial funding, that would be a very, very great solution. But who is going to do this? Is the Peace Corps doing this? Or do we still need, I don't say it's the armed forces, but somewhere uniformed forces do have the authority to do this. Secondly, we also see what we call the gray zone, where the security services have their domain. And for instance, if you go to Crimea and if you go to the Donbass region, you see that in this world, especially the security services of the Russian Federation are very active. If you go to what we saw on Crimea, the little green men, they happen to be special forces, Spetsnaz, from their military intelligence services. And they are involved in a lot more things. Skripal, OPCW, they have hackers communities, Cozy Bear, Fancy Bear, Ghostwriter, to name a few. They are behind this. So they have this entire cyber domain discovered already. And it's not only the Russian Federation, because I don't want to bash Russia. I did some research into Russian Federation, but it's not my option to bash Russia for this. Actually, I'm sometimes really look surprised, and professionally wise, I'm very interested in what they are doing. Not that I always agree with them, but I don't want to bash them for this, because China, Israel, United States, United Kingdom, Bundesnachrichtendienst, AIVD, MIVD, they're all playing in this world. They're all part of this world. We are part of this world as well in the Netherlands. So let's be honest. And it's also, if you look to what happened geopolitically, it's not the military most of the time. Well, they do some things, but it's also the world of the private military companies. Former soldiers who are now, and this is a picture of the Wagner Group, which is not German, although the name suggests it, but it's a Russian group who already fought in Syria and who already were part of the annexation of Crimea as well. So, if we look at the model which was created by the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and which I filled in with the operation line, was it enough? That was the question I asked myself. I don't think so, and NATO did not as well, and they expanded a little bit. We have the DIME acronym, Diplomacy, Information, Military and Economics, and they made it a little bit larger, and they put FIL in the end as well. FIL is the financial flows, I is the gray zone in which all the intelligence, the I from intelligence services, are very active, and the L stands for, well, there is no big difference between police force and military force anymore, and it stands for legal aspects and law enforcement. And there is a lot of organized criminality, which is part as well, which is part of non-state actors making money, and they are part of many conflicts in the world as well. So that brings me back to the geopolitical realm. Do I think that there is a role then only for civil security? Well, they're part of it, but they're not entirely part of it. And it's not only economics. Look what happened last week. Look what happened, for instance, with the EU last week. It's this, where AUKUS came into being. AUKUS, Australia, UK, United States. United States, for the first time, they did already with Great Britain, but they already also were willing to share the technology about nuclear-driven submarines, together with Australia, to form a force against China. It's not about economics. This is about military force, but it's not only military force. And look what happened to, you see, Macron. He was not amused, because the Australian Prime Minister, he cancelled an order for France, which should include 12 new submarines. 56 billion euros were involved. But they were now getting their technology from the United States, 6 nuclear-driven submarines. And what happened to the EU? Mr. Joseph Borrell, the High Commissioner for the Foreign Relations, was really surprised. He was not included. He found out by the media and the press. He was outmaneuvered. The entire European Union was outmaneuvered. And we saw the reaction of the chairperson, Mrs. von der Leyen, and she said, it's unacceptable. We stand behind France. Of course they do. Of course we want to have the ties within the EU. But this is what is happening really in the political realm. So if you think only in either militarization or civil security, I will say, wake up. Please wake up. Well, if you want to read something about it, we have, and you have to go to www.militairspectator.nl. It's English version. There are a lot of articles about what, for instance, happened and with the Russian authorities and the Russian federations, what they were doing in Crimea. And for those of you who speak Dutch, we also, at the Netherlands Defense Academy, we have a new War Studies Research Center, and they have podcasts. They have podcasts about deterrence and about hybrid warfare and about strategic decision-making and the status of all kind of international organizations, all kind of different podcasts. I highly can recommend this. And that concludes my, my introduction. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much, Han. Is my microphone on? Yes. Thank you very much. I'm sure there are many questions. I for sure have a number of them. But let's collect some of them and also invite Ralf back to the stage. If the two of you could be somehow around this table, I will take this one. And the very first thing before we turn to the audience, I would like to give you, both of you, the opportunity to ask one question to each other. So Ralf, what would be your main question to Han?
You told us a lot about the years after 9/11. I heard a lot of military thinking. We had to go to Iraq because we assumed that and so on. A lot of lies were in it. But would it not the appropriate answer to 9/11 to ask United Nations to make a policy intervention to Afghanistan or wherever? 3/4 of the violent people there in New York, they came from Saudi Arabia, not from Afghanistan or so, yeah? And would it not have been the appropriate reaction to put an international, United Nation-led policy intervention with, police intervention with strong forces, but not by the Western military means?
A very good question. My first reaction on this is in 2001, it would have been the appropriate reaction to what happened to 9/11. I fully agree. And in the ideal situation, it should be the appropriate solution in 2021 as well. Mm-hmm. But I think it's not the way many world leaders think anymore. They use the United Nations only for their own benefit. They don't see it as an independent organization who can speak and speak about the entire community. They do it most of the time unilaterally. And this example was set by, I think, the Bush administration already in 2001.
Yeah.
And which is now copied by different countries. Yeah. So at that time, yes. Nowadays, in the ideal situation, yes, for me it's still the best solution to do so. But in reality, you see that the world leaders are making completely different decisions now. And it's not only now the United States, and it was not only the Trump administration, which is accused for many things. But if we look worldwide, it's the Chinese chairperson Xi Jinping, Mr. Putin, Mr. Bolsonaro, Mr. Orban. These are all kind of big leaders are behaving very differently. So I don't see that they will go to something as the United Nations. And with that, which is very sadly, with that, the United Nations lost some authority in the entire world, I think.
With the start of our Western
Personally,
activities.
I think, yeah, even in 2021, you should go first to the UN and to discuss about this. Absolutely right. Yes.
Now your question.
Exactly. Yeah. Excellent question. Thank you very much. My point is...
question, huh?
Yeah, Absolutely.
Question point.
You gave an explanation about civil security with the 5 pillars. You discussed the conversion of the armed forces. You gave the example of the German Bundeswehr, but probably you could project it on all the armed forces in the Western world. Can you give a time frame when it will come into being? You have a lot of discussions with all kinds of high-ranking politicians and other organizations. Do you have a time frame for this?
Do you have a job tomorrow? That's basically
I think I will retire just before they dissolve the entire.
Yeah, thank you for the question, because that is a charming point of our concept, I think. That we don't say tomorrow we can cancel the German Bundeswehr or the NATO or the military armed forces. But we say, let us have a plan where we want to go in and not only to rise up the armed forces and to speak a lot of all the other political means, diplomacy and so on, but investing only money and thinking in military means. Look on the public discussing, it's only going on military means. And we don't see that in Somalia. We had tried with armed forces to give security for the people. And we failed totally. But civil women there took the action. And in northern part of Somalia, since 30 years, there is peace and freedom and no war, because they themselves talked with warlords, and they gained peace there. So it's possible without soldiers to get this peace. And so we have to start a plan, really. And our concept is a plan to start yearly rise up the instruments of civil peace servants, mediation and so on, to rise up police investments on the international level, to rise up diplomacy with Putin and other countries. So we give them the aim, we want to change our behavior. We had made failures of the western part of the world. You have made failures as well. Let us go really in a new contract, and with this aim of strong United Nations, and then we are convinced from 2025 we can lower our investments in military means, and up to 2040 we are convinced in Germany, because France and Great Britain, they don't want to cancel their military up to 2040. So the imbalance we see in the investments, we say then let's Germany take the big part of civil investments, and together, today the NATO invests 15 times more in military forces than Russia. And we want to build up our military forces. That makes no sense. Let us have a plan where we want to go.
Thank you very much. All kinds of new questions pop up, but let's first turn to the audience to see who wants to raise a question to either of the gentlemen here. The gentleman in the back, yes, to the pillar, yes. You.
Mr. Becker, thank you very much for your very interesting story. And it sounds to me that you are a bit naive.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if I hear the name Putin, I think of old elf of the Rolling Stones. He's lying all the time. And that's what he does. Well, in the Volkskrant this morning stood the fall of the last elections of last weekend. He pushed one button and he won the elections.
Yeah.
What happened to the Dutch plane, to Ukraine? He poisons his fellow members of Russian people. I don't trust this person. When he has a nice tomb in the Kremlin, and there will be a democracy later on, I hope then we can do business with Russia.
Okay, I hope that the audience at home was also able to listen to this. Otherwise, we will get a microphone in the room for the next question. But let's first, on the basis of the answer, you will also get the question.
So you ask whether our concept and our trust in Putin is naive. First, let me ask whether it isn't naive to go with military armed forces in Afghanistan and in Mali and to think we can deliver their peace and grow up a new civil society. That's what I call naive. Yeah? where you are right, we are not naive with Putin. Putin is a liar, and Putin is a power politician, of course. He is very brutal, we know this. But you have to go in exchange with such people as well, with the Taliban, with all the others. Because if you try to convince them by military forces, by armed forces, you will lose. You told us that the first year was a success in Afghanistan. But what happened? The Taliban went to Pakistan because the Pashtun region is not only in Afghanistan, it's in Pakistan as well. So they, like the Soviet troops in the Second World War, they went in another region, they waited for the winter, and then they came back and they won the war. Yeah, so that's naive to think, yeah, we only have to better our strategy here with NATO and so on, and then next time we could deal in another way with terrorists. No, we have to deal with Putin and to see our own responsibility in his change of becoming such a brutal leader. So he was not all the time such a brutal leader. He wanted to become a member of NATO, and we neglected him and said, no, that's not possible. Yeah, he wanted to be cooperative with us. And if we start with him seriously in seeing Germany is investing in United Nations and not in an own military means, and then he can build trust again. That's, of course, yeah, it's 10, 20 years of discussing with each other. You are not tomorrow with trust with him, but trust or start with small pieces of build up trust again. And then after 5 years, you will be surprised what is possible with such leaders if they gain trust to you again. But we have been to Libya, to Kosovo, and so on, and did destroy the trust of him in the Western point. So let us not be naive, let us be realistic, but let us be realistic in what we can achieve as well.
Part of your story, Ralf, is that you count on rational people, right? You count on people to be, in the end, irrational. Yeah. Are all of them rational? Huh? Are the Putins and the Bolsonaros, and perhaps even the Trumps of the world, are they always rational in the end? Or can some of them actually take very strange decisions, despite our own intentions?
Yeah, so we are not against to have defense armed forces, yeah, but not for interventions outside of Europe. So for defense, of course, we have enough armed forces. After 1990, Russia and the West, we lowered our numbers of tanks and so on to such a low number that we can't really have a war on the landscape. It's not possible from the numbers. Yeah, so it's only in the cyber war it's possible, or in Ukraine or so on, but it's not possible in the big. So for defense, okay. Yeah. But we don't need it for intervention outside.
Okay. There was another question, the gentleman behind there. Yes.
Thank you. This one question is to Colonel Bouwmeester. Is I pronounced correctly?
Yes.
Okay. I want to ask about the dime concept, right? There's still the M part, which people can concern about because due to Europe's potential power. How to make sure that the M part of the military not getting too powerful, because power tend to lead to power, because that's mainly the concern about. Yes, thank you.
Well, that's a very good question. Thank you for that. How to limit only the use of military forces to solve a conflict? I think it was already explained by Mr. Becker. After all these operations we did, we now more or less came to the conclusion we can't do it in our own. Sometimes you have to use the military because they are the first troops who go in an insecure environment and try to make it more secure. And if you want to develop a country, you have to make it secure as well. Security and development goes together. If you want to develop the country and there is no security, you cannot develop it. There is no freedom, and people are not willing to develop and contribute to this development. On the other hand, if you only focus on the security part and use armed forces for this, it will not work either. Because there is no development, people are not willing to lay down their arms, and to pick up a job and to add to the economy. So this is already the model we are thinking about and how to limit this. We need to think about it. We need to think about it, what the role of the politicians is, the role of the high-ranking militaries, and to have very good discussions about what is the preferred end state for the politicians, and tell me how to reach it. And what we did, for instance, in Afghanistan, every half year we changed our plan. We shifted from this to that, and that became the end state, and that became the end state. That is not good. Then every time you will see what happened in Afghanistan and what happened in other operations as well. That doesn't work for the military. And it's not, and let me iterate it again, it's not only a job for the military. Where we see if you want to bring security and development, it should be much broader than that, to make clear that those countries will change and have no conflicts anymore.
Okay. There's one point, and I think that Ralf wants to react to as well, and that is the point that you already earlier made as well. It's only the military that can go in. It's about building, if it's about building schools or roads, rebuilding, it's the military that have to do that. And I saw your reaction to that.
Yeah, it's the military to take the first step,
Yeah.
to give security. You say sometimes, okay, but you presume and assume, regularly the armed forces have to go in first to deliver security, and then the civil forces can come in. That's a wrong picture. The United Nations officially have acknowledged a non-violent peace force to give security to women and men on the ground during a high violated conflict. Because really human peacekeepers, they are accompanying the civil persons in the war, and so the people are safe. That's really proved that it's working, and it's more working than military security. If you ask the people in Mali, northern part of Mali, who is delivering us security, that are not the international armed forces, that are not the national armed forces, that are other civil forces which are delivering security for them. So our picture on security is combined with military. I want to question this picture, really.
Thank you. Let's go back to very far end of the room. Peter.
Yeah. Okay.
And
First
then we'll go to you.
Yeah.
It's a bit a different question. I thought it was a good idea to leave Afghanistan. I thought we shouldn't have gone there. And then a few weeks ago, somebody wrote in, I don't remember, Volkskrant or NRC, we shouldn't have left Afghanistan because now international terroristic groups have their home place in Afghanistan and we will not be able to control them. What is your idea about this?
Who are you asking this
Perhaps
question
first
to?
you, both of you perhaps.
Yeah, both.
Well, the reason we went in, the reason not only we, the NATO came later, but the reason the United States went in was exactly this reason in 2001. And what you see is, after 20 years of conflict there, it didn't help that much. It's not the secure environment we would like to have it now at this time. So, yeah, was it very successful? I leave it up to all the people because I contribute to this. I'm probably a little bit biased on this. But if you don't do anything, you're absolutely sure that this is a location where other groups, terrorist groups, and organized crime as well will come together and will have training places. And it will cause a lot of damage in the rest of the world if you don't do anything about it.
But should we have stayed? And if so, for how
Sorry?
long? Should we have stayed now in Afghanistan? Or the Americans or we? And if so, for how long?
I was deployed there in 2009, and I already saw the Afghanistan is a country without any structures, like we see in Western democracies, in constitutional states. There was no police, there was no government, there was no mayor, there was not a cabinet. we all thought that if we implement this Western idea of democracy and bring it there, it will be solved then. But that was, I think, a little bit naive to think in this way, because Afghanistan is completely structured in another way. It's a tribal system. If you want to be effective, think in a tribal way. Don't think in an overarching government. Don't think in an overarching army who can do this. But try to discuss with these tribals. And the tribals themselves, they have all kinds of issues in between them, which are not very visible from the outside. If you are an outsider and you come in, it will take you years and years and years to understand what is going on. And in the Western media, much of the incidents were always addressed that the Western troops were fighting Taliban, but the Western troops were sometimes in the middle of these tribal fights. But then we put a frame on it and said it was the Taliban who did this. So when I was there in 2009, I said, well, I don't know whether we have the patience. If you want to implement this Western idea, it will take you 50, maybe longer than that, and we don't have the patience for that, especially not the political side, and we don't have the money for that to pay for all this.
And you can't force a society to accept a Western culture of democracy or so by armed forces. That doesn't function. Even in 50 years, it's not possible. We have to respect the culture of other countries, like Obama did 2011 when he went to Cairo University and worshipped the Muslimic world. That's calming down the terrorists. The worshipping of their culture of life, and not to be in hybris and thinking our Western culture is the best culture for whole the world. So we can't, by military means or even by force, we can't control all over the world with military means terrorists or other societies. That doesn't function, never on the world. But we have to learn that cultures are different and that are different solutions, and we have to handle with them about this. And it's possible. I showed the big international meetings in 1990 in Paris, the agreement. In 2005 in the United Nations Assembly, the agreement responsibility to protect. So we have the chance to come to an agreement where then if you have some terrorists, you can send international police to it. Okay, solves the problem. But international police from United Nations and not from NATO. NATO is not indifferent part of the game, but we have our own economic interests and the whole world knows it. If you have the secret services, what the CIA did in Central and South America, in the Near East, they are destroyed democratic valued societies and governments for our own interests. So we have not the responsibility to be the police of the world, but only the United Nations, and let us trust this trust again, and then we can handle with all governments the rest of terrorists.
Thank you very much. There was another question there. I promised you to give you the floor as well.
Yes, but but Ralf has to catch his taxi as well, so there might be a conflict, but we can do the question and perhaps Ralf...
It's another conflict we can easily solve.
Yes, okay. I'll give the mic.
More dilemma.
And then Ralf can get his stuff. We'll bring him to the taxi.
What time is it?
It's a hard question for Ralf. So if you really have to go, then you have to go.
3 minutes. Yeah, 3 minutes. 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Okay. You say to us that if countries have good diplomacy, in the end, Europe must not intervene anymore outside of Europe. But I have the feeling that the West and Europe is morally obliged sometimes to do so. So, for example, right now, the issue with the Uyghurs in China. I don't know, how do you look at that issue?
China, we go in an attitude, they learn from the West, of course. Now they do a power play, internationally. But if we worship that China has lowered the poverty rate for international means, yeah, very, very much in the last 20 or 30 years. Just let us worship the Chinese people and government in the first, when we meet them, to worship what they have achieved. Yeah, really what other regions of the world did not achieve, that they really did a good job. And then let us worship that they have a terrorist problem with Muslimic terrorists. And they decided to build up such concentrating fields, but they did not decide to put war on this region. We decide from the Western to go in Iraq, to go in Afghanistan with nearly 2 million dead people, and that's our answer on Muslimic terrorism. And they have the answer to build concentrate fields and to educate people. So we try to educate people in other fields as well. That's better than to fight them with armed forces. But of course, we should really strong debate with them about the human rights of these aspects. But to worship as well the relativeness of their answer on this challenge compared to our answers we are destroying all over the world.
Thank you very much. Ralf, you have some work to do in Germany as well for the coming years, not even tonight. So thank you very much again for joining us.
That's me.
Oh, that's you? Okay. This is who? Yes?
Yeah, I'll take Ralf to the taxi.
Okay, and I will close this, close the meeting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. It would not be fair to continue the discussion with only one person, but perhaps you will be available for one or two questions, just informally after I have closed the meeting. Thanks, everyone. Join us again with Studium Generale the next time. Keep a good eye on the website and on the flyer, and hope to see you next time. Thanks very much.